They told him he didn't belong in the advanced class. So the teacher wrote the hardest equation on the board, just to humiliate him. The whole class laughed, betting he'd fail before the first line. But when he picked up the chalk, what happened next left the entire room in silence. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The room smelled faintly of dry erase markers and old textbooks, the kind of classroom air that seemed stale even with the windows cracked open. Desks lined up in perfect rows, each filled with restless juniors, some doodling in the margins of their notebooks, others half asleep, and a few trying to look engaged. The late afternoon sun spilled across the chalkboard, where Mr. Whitaker stood with a deliberate stiffness, his posture carrying the weight of authority that dared anyone to challenge him. Mr. Whitaker was known for his sharpness, his pressed shirts, his biting tone, his absolute intolerance for mistakes. But he was also known for something else, though it was whispered, not written down. The way his standards always seemed to shift, depending on who stood in front of him. He claimed he demanded excellence from all, but the quiet patterns of his exams by humiliation painted a different story. No one missed that Marcus Hall, the only black student in his AP calculus class, was often the chosen target. That afternoon, Mr. Whitaker's gaze scanned the room, cold and calculating. He tapped the chalk against the board, the sharp clicking echoing like a metronome that kept everyone uneasy. "Let's see," he said slowly, his voice smooth but cutting. "Who among you is actually keeping up with my lessons? Too many of you think you can skate through this class. That ends today." The chalk scratched against the board as he began writing, each symbol deliberate, stretching across the green surface like a dare. It wasn't the kind of problem that belonged on a regular test. It was monstrous, weaving together trigonometric substitutions, limits, and multiple integrals. A patchwork of nightmare fuel even for college freshmen. The class grew still, heads tilting, eyes squinting. Some gave up even trying to follow along after the second line. When the equation was finally complete, the board looked like an intimidating wall of logic no one dared climb. "Now," Mr. Whitaker said, turning to face the class. His eyes scanned the room, hunting for his prey. He paused, letting the silence grow heavy, letting the tension push down on every desk. Then his gaze locked on Marcus, who sat near the middle row, his notebook neatly open, his pencil still resting on the spiral. Marcus had been taking notes quietly, as always, not calling attention to himself. "Marcus Hall," Whitaker said, his voice slicing through the air. "Why don't you come up here and show us how it's done?" The room shifted, chairs creaked as students leaned forward. A few exchanged looks, some smirking, some sympathetic. Everyone knew this wasn't random. Whitaker never picked Jason, the son of a local banker who could barely follow the homework. He never picked Lily, who was vocal but often wrong. No, he always picked Marcus, as though daring him to fail in front of 30 witnesses. Marcus's stomach tightened. He felt every pair of eyes on him, burning holes in his back. But he didn't argue. He never argued. Slowly, he rose, sliding his notebook closed, his movements steady despite the pounding in his chest. As he walked to the board, whispers rippled. Someone muttered, "Good luck, man," half mocking, half pity. Another chuckled under their breath. "This should be quick." Whitaker folded his arms across his chest. "Come on, Marcus. Show us what you've got." Marcus stood in front of the equation, staring at it. Up close, it was even more intimidating. The symbols looming like a wall meant to keep him out. He held his breath. His fingers twitched at his sides. He knew exactly what this was. This wasn't about the math. This was about proving again that he didn't belong, that he was here only because the school wanted to boast about diversity. For a moment, Marcus's throat tightened. He thought of walking back to his desk, surrendering the chalk, giving Mr. Whitaker the satisfaction of a smirk, the class their expected entertainment. But then he remembered something. His mother's voice, calm but firm, telling him just last night, "Don't you ever let someone else decide your worth, Marcus. You know what you know. That's enough." He reached for the chalk. The room was so quiet that the scratch of the chalk on the tray echoed like thunder. His hand trembled, not from fear but from the weight of all those watching eyes. His classmates leaned in, waiting for him to falter. Whitaker tilted his head slightly, a half-smile playing on his lips as though he were watching a play he had already seen the ending of. Marcus placed the chalk against the board. His hand shook just enough for the first mark to look hesitant. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the back row. But when he turned his face slightly, His eyes weren't weak. They were sharp, focused, carrying a fire that no one expected. He began to write. The chalk squeaked across the board as Marcus laid down the first line. The class murmured, trying to catch what he was doing, trying to see if he even had a plan. Mr. Whitaker leaned forward just slightly, his smirk freezing. Marcus wasn't stalling. He wasn't bluffing. His hand moved with purpose, each line connecting to the next. The shaky start was gone, replaced by a rhythm, a clarity, a confidence that spread with every stroke. The students shifted again, this time in genuine surprise. Some furrowed their brows, realizing Marcus wasn't stumbling. Others leaned back, arms crossed, refusing to believe what they were seeing. And in that heavy silence, one truth became clear. Marcus wasn't here to play Whitaker's game. He was here to rewrite it. Yet just as the chalk glided confidently, Marcus suddenly stopped midway through a calculation. His hand froze in the air, and his breathing quickened. A cold doubt flickered in his mind. What if I'm wrong? What if I just prove them all right? The chalk hovered, the line unfinished. The room leaned forward again, caught in the tension of the moment, and Marcus, still holding the chalk, turned his head slightly, his sharp eyes locking with Mr. Whitaker's. He hadn't said a word, but the challenge was clear. The cliffhanger was set. Marcus's hand shook once more, this time not from fear, but from the weight of proving more than just a math problem. Would he finish? Would he fall? The board waited, the class held its breath, and Marcus prepared to make his move. The chalk was still in Marcus's hand, his unfinished calculation hanging in the air like a suspended note in a symphony. The silence of the classroom pressed against his ears, and in that suspended moment, memories began to claw their way into his mind. Reminders of why this moment mattered far more than a grade or a problem on a board. Marcus Hall wasn't the kind of student who made noise. He was the boy who sat quietly in the middle rows, never asking for attention, never drawing it. His clothes were simple, always pressed because his mother insisted that appearance spoke before words ever could. His sneakers weren't new, but they were spotless, because she'd taught him to take pride in what he had. His life outside of these four walls wasn't glamorous. He lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment with his mother and younger sister, Naomi. His mother, Cassandra, worked double shifts as a nurse, often coming home with tired feet and sore shoulders, but she still managed to check his homework before collapsing on the couch. She believed in Marcus with a fierce determination that made up for what the world denied him. But the world had been cruel early. Back in middle school, Marcus had learned quickly how differently people measured him. In 7th grade, when the school placed students in advanced tracks, Marcus had scored high enough on the placement exam to qualify, but when the results came back, his name wasn't on the list. He remembered approaching the guidance counselor's office, clutching his test paper, his voice small but steady. There must be a mistake. I passed the cutoff. The counselor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes but dismissive undertones, had smiled thinly. Marcus, sometimes these tests don't capture the whole picture. We just want to make sure students are ready before we place them in challenging classes. He hadn't argued then. He had lowered his eyes, folded the test paper back into his backpack, and walked out. But inside, something had broken. It wasn't that they thought he wasn't smart enough. It was that they'd already decided he wasn't. A year later it happened again. A teacher, after handing back a test Marcus had aced, looked at him with disbelief. Did someone help you with this? Be honest. The words hadn't been cruel in tone, but their weight had been heavier than any insult. Marcus remembered staring at his paper, the red A circled at the top, and wondering why his excellence looked suspicious in someone else's eyes. Those seeds of doubt planted deep. They grew each time a teacher looked past his raised hand. Each time classmates whispered, "He's just lucky." Each time his achievements were questioned while others were celebrated. By high school, Marcus had built armor. He kept his head down, did his work, and let silence protect him. He studied late at night, long after his mother had gone to sleep, his textbooks lit by the dim lamp on the kitchen table. Numbers and equations became his refuge, a world where answers didn't care about skin color, though the people grading them often did. But silence had a cost. While his peers formed study groups, Marcus worked alone. While others traded jokes with teachers, Marcus avoided unnecessary conversation. He learned that invisibility was safer than confrontation, even if it meant carrying the loneliness of being underestimated. That loneliness followed him into Mr. Whitaker's classroom. Whitaker, with his immaculate shirts and clipped voice, reminded Marcus of every teacher who had doubted him, Every adult who claimed to push him for his own good. The man never called on Jason or Lily to tackle impossible problems. He only singled out Marcus, framing it as high expectations, when everyone in the room knew it was a test of humiliation. And yet, despite it all, Marcus endured. Because someone had taught him not to quit. His brother, Darius. Darius had been 3 years older, brilliant in his own right, with a mind that loved patterns and puzzles. He had been Marcus's first tutor, the one who sat with him at the kitchen table, breaking down concepts into simple steps, showing him how to see the elegance in equations. Darius should have gone far. He had earned a scholarship to a state university, but before he could even step foot on campus, the world's quiet biases clipped his wings. Marcus remembered overhearing the conversation between his brother and their mother late one night. "They told me the scholarship was given to someone else," Darius had said, his voice tight with anger. "Said they reevaluated the criteria. But Mom, my scores were higher. You know they were." Cassandra had tried to soothe him, but Marcus had heard the defeat in her sigh. He had watched his brother, once so full of hope, slip into a job stocking shelves at a grocery store instead of solving equations in a classroom. The injustice lingered like a wound that never healed. Darius had passed away the year before, a sudden illness taking him before his brilliance could be fully realized. But his lessons remained alive in Marcus's mind. Every time he solved a problem, he could hear Darius's voice. "Don't just do the math, Marcus. Understand it. Own it. That way no one can take it from you." And now, standing before Whitaker's impossible equation, Marcus felt the weight of all those memories pressing into him. Every time someone doubted him, every time his worth was dismissed, every time his brother had been denied, they were all here, in the chalk between his fingers. The class saw only a boy hesitating. But Marcus knew he was standing on a battlefield, carrying the ghosts of every injustice he'd endured. He lifted the chalk again, determination burning behind his eyes. The room expected hesitation. Instead, he began to write with steady strokes, his mind sharper than the whispers, sharper than the prejudice, sharper even than the doubt clawing at him. But as he wrote, another memory surged, a darker one. 8th grade. A substitute teacher, frustrated when Marcus corrected her mistake on the board, had snapped in front of the class, "Why don't you sit down? Don't get smart with me." The class had laughed, not because it was funny, but because they knew what it really meant. She hadn't said don't be arrogant. She had said don't be smart. For him, intelligence was defiance. And standing in Whitaker's classroom now, with chalk in hand, Marcus realized this wasn't about solving a problem. It was about rewriting years of being told he wasn't enough. The chalk screeched against the board. As he closed out another line of logic, students leaned in closer, confusion painted on their faces. He wasn't faltering. He wasn't lost. But deep inside, Marcus felt something else brewing, a pressure that wasn't about the math. It was about what would happen after. Because he knew Whitaker wouldn't let this go easily. The seeds planted in middle school had grown into this moment, and Marcus could feel it. The teacher's next move wouldn't just test his math, it would test his very right to belong. And as the board filled with his precise writing, Marcus knew this wasn't the end of the humiliation. It was just the beginning. The chalk scratched steadily against the board, each stroke echoing in the heavy silence of the classroom. Marcus's hand moved with a rhythm he had trained for years, his focus sharp, though his heart pounded in his chest like a drum. But outside his own concentration, the atmosphere in the room was alive, charged, watching, waiting. Every student's eyes were on him. Some leaned forward with curiosity, their brows furrowed, wondering if he actually knew what he was doing. Others reclined in their seats with smirks on their faces, already predicting the crash, waiting for the stumble that would prove their suspicions right. And then there were those who whispered behind half-raised hands, trading cruel jokes in hushed tones. "Bad he freezes up," one boy muttered to his neighbor. "Whitaker's setting him up again," a girl whispered back, not unkindly, but with the weary tone of someone who had seen this before. The room was a stage, and Marcus was the unwilling performer. Yet the performance wasn't meant to showcase his brilliance. It was orchestrated to expose his failure. At least that was what everyone thought. In the second row, Jason slouched in his chair, his sneakers propped against the desk rung. He didn't even bother pretending to care about the math problem. He just smirked, his voice low but sharp enough to reach Marcus. "Kid thinks he's Einstein now." A couple of chuckles followed, the kind of laughter that wasn't loud enough to draw Whitaker's reprimand, but just loud enough to sting. Marcus's ears burned. but he didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the board. In the back row, Lily chewed her pen, whispering to her friend, "You think he can actually do it?" Her friend shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Whitaker's just waiting for him to mess up. You can tell." And it was true. At the front of the room, Mr. Whitaker leaned back against his desk, his arms folded across his chest. His expression carried the smug patience of someone who already believed he knew the outcome. His eyes narrowed as he studied Marcus, almost daring him to falter. The man's silence wasn't encouraging. It was suffocating, a spotlight that illuminated only failure. The tension was suffocating for Marcus, but it was familiar. He had been here before, not on this exact stage, but in the shadows of low expectations and carefully concealed condescension. He knew the looks, the raised eyebrows when his answers were correct, the sighs of disbelief, the sideways glances as if intelligence didn't belong to him. Still, he wrote. Step after step, his strokes grew steadier, sharper, as though each symbol carved away a layer of doubt. The whispers softened, not out of respect, but out of confusion. No one had expected him to last this long. Then a sudden cough broke the silence, followed by a mutter. He probably memorized it. Whitaker probably gave him the answer before class. The accusation hung in the air, poisonous and heavy. Marcus froze for the briefest second, his hand hovering. It wasn't the first time he'd heard such words, but here, now, with the entire class as witness, the cruelty felt sharper. Whitaker didn't shut it down. He didn't defend Marcus. He just let the words dangle, his thin smile barely changing. That silence spoke louder than any reprimand. Marcus gripped the chalk tighter, pressing through the sting. His brother's voice whispered in the back of his mind. They'll doubt you, Marcus. That's their game. But your answers don't lie. Don't give them what they want. So he continued. Line after line, calculation after calculation. The board slowly filled, his movements gaining confidence. The room shifted once more, whispers fading, smirks softening into wide-eyed stares. But the disbelief didn't vanish. It transformed. How is he doing that? Someone whispered. Is he right? Another voice asked, this time tinged with awe. And yet for every spark of admiration, there was a shadow of suspicion. The atmosphere wasn't supportive. It was restless, unstable, teetering between mockery and reluctant respect. Marcus's back felt heavy, like the weight of every stare pressed down on his spine. He wanted to turn, to tell them this wasn't luck, this wasn't memorization, this was work, years of quiet nights, years of being doubted, years of carrying the weight of being told he didn't belong. But he said nothing. He let the chalk speak. Still, he felt the sting of isolation. Because even as the whispers dimmed, he knew most of them weren't rooting for him. They were waiting for the slip, the wrong sign, the error that would confirm every prejudice. And Whitaker was waiting too. The teacher's arms stayed folded, his eyes unblinking. His smirk had thinned, but his silence remained. He didn't interrupt. He didn't guide. He simply stood there, a sentinel of judgment, poised to pounce the moment. Marcus faltered. At one point Marcus paused, scanning the line of his work. His hand hovered again, as if reconsidering his next move. The room held its breath. Jason chuckled softly, muttering, "Here it comes. Told you." But then Marcus wrote the next line with clarity, the chalk gliding smoothly as if he'd only paused for effect. A small gasp rippled from the corner of the room. Even Lily, who had doubted him earlier, leaned forward whispering, "He's actually doing it." Still Whitaker's silence loomed. And then something shifted. Marcus, in his focused rhythm, began to notice it. The teacher wasn't just watching. He was studying. Each line Marcus wrote was mirrored in Whitaker's sharp gaze, as if he wasn't just expecting a mistake but waiting for one he could exploit. And then, it hit Marcus with a sickening realization. Whitaker didn't want him to fail by chance. He wanted him to fail by force. The realization shook him. Was Whitaker planning to claim his work was wrong even if it wasn't? To discredit him in front of everyone regardless of the truth? His heart thudded harder. The chalk felt heavier in his hand. He could solve the problem flawlessly, but would it matter if the man holding authority had already decided the outcome? The classroom was thick with unspoken tension, the whispers now replaced by the scratch of chalk and the quiet sound of shallow breaths. 30 students sat suspended in a strange limbo, half waiting for Marcus to collapse, half realizing they might be witnessing something they hadn't expected. Brilliance. But brilliance was dangerous in the wrong eyes. Marcus finished another step, the board now nearly filled, the impossible equation unraveling under his steady hand. For the first time, a flicker of unease passed across Whitaker's face. Quick, almost imperceptible, but real. Marcus caught it. That tiny crack in the teacher's confidence. And it gave him fuel. He pressed the chalk harder, his final strokes carving into the board with deliberate precision. His focus sharpened into defiance. But just as the last line neared completion, Whitaker moved. He shifted off the desk, standing taller, arms still folded but his stance firmer, as though ready to pounce. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with something colder than skepticism. Control. And Marcus, mid-stroke, realized what everyone else was about to see. Whitaker wasn't just waiting for him to fail. He was ready to declare it, no matter what the truth was. The class held its breath, unaware that the true challenge wasn't the math at all. It was the man standing in judgment, arms folded, waiting to turn brilliance into humiliation. The chalk hovered in Marcus's hand, the unfinished line waiting on the board. Behind him, the silence of the classroom thickened, heavy with whispers unsaid, and in front of him, Mr. Whitaker stood tall, his arms folded, his posture the embodiment of judgment. The equation on the board wasn't just math anymore. It was a mirror reflecting something deeper, something Marcus had known for a long time, but never spoken aloud. This wasn't the first time Whitaker had placed him under this kind of spotlight. It had become almost ritual. When Jason got a question wrong in class, Whitaker chuckled lightly, waved it off and said, "Close, try again after class." When Lily struggled, he leaned over her desk, guiding her gently, saying, "You're on the right track, keep pushing yourself." But when Marcus hesitated even for a second, Whitaker's tone shifted. It sharpened, clinical, and public. "Marcus, you're in AP Calculus now. You need to prove you deserve to be here." That word, prove, was the blade Whitaker wielded. It cut Marcus again and again, a subtle reminder that his presence was conditional, never assumed, always on trial. The cruelest part was that Whitaker framed it as high expectations. He presented it as fairness, as pushing Marcus to his potential. But Marcus knew the difference. Expectation was offering support, bias was building a wall and then demanding he climb it alone, while others were given ladders. The memories pressed on him, surfacing with painful clarity. It wasn't just this class. It had followed him through every grade. The quiet sting of teachers expecting less, of adults acting surprised when his answers were correct, of being praised not for his intelligence but for his effort, as though achievement from him was an accident, not ability. One moment, in particular, returned with haunting clarity. 2 years earlier, sophomore year, parent-teacher conferences, Marcus had sat beside his mother, Cassandra, in a room that smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. His mother's tired scrubs still bore the creases of a 12-hour shift. She had come anyway, determined to hear how her son was doing. Whitaker, then his math teacher in Algebra 2, had greeted them with that same professional smile, polished and polite. He spoke about grades, assignments, attendance. On paper, everything was perfect. Marcus had straight A's, but then came the phrase Marcus had grown to dread. "Marcus is doing well," Whitaker said, folding his hands, "but I sometimes worry he's performing above his natural ability. I don't want him to burn out." His mother's brows knit together. "What do you mean, above his ability? He's always been good at math. Since he was little." Whitaker's smile didn't falter, but his tone carried the faint condescension Marcus recognized too well.
"Of course, he's hardworking, very hardworking. But sometimes students like Marcus, well, they thrive short-term because they put in extra effort, but long-term, when the material gets more advanced, they can struggle. I just want to prepare you for that possibility." Marcus had sat frozen, his stomach twisting. Students like Marcus. The phrase hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. It wasn't about study habits. It wasn't about test preparation. It was about skin color, about assumption, about the quiet prejudice that painted his excellence as temporary. His mother hadn't let it slide. Cassandra leaned forward, her tired eyes suddenly fierce. "With all due respect, my son doesn't just put in effort, he understands this work. If he were any other student, you'd be calling him gifted, not lucky." Whitaker had raised his palms in mock surrender. Of course. Marcus is talented. I just believe in being realistic." Realistic. Another blade. Another dismissal disguised as care. Marcus had sat there, cheeks burning,
his hands gripping his knees beneath the table. He wanted to speak, to tell them he wasn't fragile, that he wasn't running on luck, that his brother Darius had taught him more math than Whitaker ever had. But he had stayed silent, because he had learned that speaking up only made the bias stronger. And now in the present, with the chalk in his hand and the impossible problem nearly solved, Marcus realized the truth. Whitaker wasn't testing his math. He was continuing a pattern, a years-long ritual of demanding Marcus justify his right to stand in the same room as his peers. The classroom atmosphere was suffocating, not just because of the whispers, but because everyone else had absorbed the same narrative. Marcus was on trial, not the equation. His peers had learned to doubt him, not because of his performance, but because of how teachers like Whitaker framed him. Every smirk, every whisper of "he's just lucky," it was rooted in that same bias, and Marcus could feel it pressing against him like 1,000 invisible hands. But then an unexpected twist stirred the air. Lily, the girl in the back row who had doubted him earlier, leaned forward in her seat, whispering to her neighbor, "Wait, I think he's right. Look, he's setting up the substitution correctly." Her words carried, not loudly, but enough. Other students leaned forward, eyes scanning the board. The tide of whispers shifted. For the first time, some voices weren't mocking. They were curious. Jason, however, scoffed loudly, forcing the room back into its cruel balance. "Yeah, right. He probably practiced this one at home. No way he's solving this cold." Marcus's hand tightened on the chalk. His heartbeat thudded. Every memory of being told he was above his ability, every backhanded compliment, every doubt, it all surged inside him. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch Whitaker's eyes. The teacher's smirk was thinner now, tighter, but it was still there, still waiting. And then Marcus remembered something his mother had whispered after that parent-teacher meeting years ago, when they were walking back to the car. "You listen to me, Marcus. Don't let their doubts become your truth. They'll dress it up in fancy words. Realistic, hard-working, above your ability. But it's all the same thing. They're afraid of you being smarter than they expect. Prove them wrong quietly. That's the loudest sound you'll ever make." The words steadied him. But the memory didn't end there, because just before they had left Whitaker's classroom that day, Cassandra had stood tall, her voice calm but sharp. "You may think you're preparing us for reality, Mr. Whitaker. But let me tell you something. You are underestimating my son, and one day he'll show you. Not by raising his voice, by being undeniable." And now, years later, Marcus stood under Whitaker's gaze once more, undeniable proof stretching across the chalkboard. The classroom atmosphere was electric, a storm caught between mockery and revelation. The whispers battled, the smirks faltered, the doubt wavered. But Whitaker's arms folded tighter, his eyes narrowing further. His silence wasn't surrender, it was calculation. And Marcus, chalk in hand, felt the dread of what would come next, because Whitaker wasn't going to let this stand. The equation was nearly complete. The class was nearly convinced. But Marcus knew the man at the front wasn't done yet. He had seen it before. The bias had always been hidden beneath high expectations. And this time Marcus could feel it. Whitaker was about to raise the stakes. The board was nearly full now, symbols stretching across the green surface, like a map of a long and dangerous journey. Marcus stood before it, his body still, his hand clenched tight around the chalk. From behind, the class saw only silence, only pause, only hesitation. To them it looked like he was frozen, paralyzed by fear, out of his depth, moments away from collapse. But inside his mind, a storm raged. Equations raced across his thoughts in rapid flashes. Substitutions, simplifications, alternative paths. He was replaying every line he had written, scanning for cracks, testing each step against the logic drilled into him over years of practice. The pause wasn't failure. It was strategy. It was the storm before clarity. Yet the class couldn't see that. "See?" Jason whispered with a smug grin. "Told you. He's stuck." A couple of snickers rippled, not loud but sharp enough to puncture the silence. Someone in the back muttered, "Bet he just copied notes. Doesn't actually get it." The atmosphere tilted once again, the fragile respect Marcus had built in the last few moments, wobbling, threatening to collapse into ridicule. Whitaker's arms stayed folded. His smirk remained, though thinner, tighter now, as if he was savoring the pause. To him this was confirmation. He didn't need to say anything. The silence said it for him. Marcus's chest tightened, his throat dry. He felt the weight of every assumption pressing on him. The whispers from classmates. The smug eyes of Jason. The cold stare of Whitaker. The room wasn't rooting for him to succeed. It was waiting for him to fail, ready to pounce the second his chalk slipped. And for a brief flicker of a moment, Marcus thought about surrendering. Just putting down the chalk, shrugging, and taking his seat. It would be easier, safer, less humiliating than dragging out the inevitable. But then his mother's voice returned, sharp and steady in his memory. Don't you dare shrink yourself to make them comfortable. And then his brother's voice layered over it. If you know the path, walk it. Even if they're waiting for you to trip. He tightened his grip on the chalk. His shoulders squared. The pause ended. With one swift, deliberate motion, Marcus pressed the chalk against the board and wrote. The sound rang louder than usual, like a declaration. Not hesitation, not fear, confidence. The first line came quickly, his handwriting neat, angled with precision. The class straightened in surprise, their whispers cut short mid-breath. Jason blinked, his smirk faltering. Lily leaned forward, eyes wide. It wasn't the line of someone fumbling. It was the line of someone who knew. Marcus didn't stop there. His strokes gained speed, his rhythm returning, step after step unfolded seamlessly. His logic was airtight, each symbol leading naturally into the next. He was no longer surviving the board. He was owning it. The whispers changed tone. Wait. He's actually right. No way. Is this… Hold up. I think he just nailed that substitution. The tide was turning again. Whitaker's smirk flattened into a thin, unreadable line. He shifted slightly, uncrossing his arms only to clasp them behind his back. The movement was subtle, but Marcus noticed it. The teacher wasn't comfortable anymore. He was watching closer now, his eyes flicking between each symbol with sharp calculation. Marcus didn't need his approval, but the realization that he was shaking Whitaker's certainty gave him fuel. His strokes grew bolder, sharper. His posture shifted from hesitant to steady, from tentative to commanding. The boy who had walked to the board under the weight of humiliation was no longer the same boy standing there now. He was in control. But even as Marcus found his rhythm, he felt the subtle danger rising. Because confidence could spark something even worse than mockery. It could spark resentment. And sure enough, it came. Jason leaned back in his seat, voice cutting through the murmurs.
Yeah, okay, maybe he's doing it. But what's the point? Nobody cares if he can do math tricks. He's still…
He didn't finish the sentence, but the weight of what he left unsaid hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. He's still black. The room didn't need him to say it fully. They felt it. Marcus felt it. His stomach twisted. His chalk paused for the briefest second. Not because he doubted the math, but because Jason's words reminded him of the deeper truth. No matter how perfect his answer, some people would never see beyond their bias. But then he remembered his mother again. You don't fight bias with their words. You fight it by being undeniable. So he wrote faster, harder, as if every stroke was erasing Jason's voice from the room. The equation neared its end. The problem that had looked impossible when Whitaker wrote it now stretched across the board in clean, undeniable logic. Students leaned forward, wide-eyed, realizing they were witnessing something they had never expected. And still Marcus said nothing. His silence wasn't fear anymore. It was power. He didn't need to explain, to justify, to argue. The math was his voice, and it spoke louder than their whispers. By the time he reached the final step, the classroom atmosphere had shifted completely. The smirks were gone. The whispers had thinned. Even Jason had fallen silent, his smugness cracking. Marcus's chalk slowed, hovering over the last line. The room held its breath. Whitaker's gaze sharpened, his jaw tight. And then, with a steady hand, Marcus drew the final stroke, completing the solution. The board was full. The impossible problem was solved. The silence that followed was heavier than any laughter or ridicule could have been. It wasn't disbelief. It was awe mixed with unease. Marcus set the chalk down on the tray. His hand trembled slightly, but his eyes were steady, burning with quiet defiance. He turned, facing the class. For the first time, he didn't look like the boy singled out to fail. He looked like the boy who had defied every expectation. But the silence didn't last, because Whitaker finally moved. He unfolded his arms, stepped forward, and scanned the board. His eyes darted from line to line, his expression unreadable. The class waited, suspended between triumph and denial. Marcus's chest pounded. He had done everything right. He knew he had. But in this room, in this moment, The truth didn't belong only to logic. It belonged to Whitaker. And as the teacher turned back to face the class, his lips curling into a thin, deliberate expression, Marcus realized the fight wasn't over. The board was solved. But Whitaker was about to decide whether his brilliance would be recognized or erased. The chalk lay in the tray, dust scattering faintly in the sunlight. Marcus had done it. He had solved the problem completely. Yet the silence that followed wasn't celebratory. It wasn't filled with admiration. It was filled with hesitation, with disbelief, with something sharper than mere surprise. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant laughter of students from the hallway outside. Inside this room, however, the tension was unbearable. Then, like a match to kindling, the whispers started. He probably just got lucky. No way he did all that by himself. Come on, he must have seen that problem before. The murmurs weren't just skepticism, they were bets. Quiet voices, trading odds like gamblers in a back room, wagering whether Marcus's victory would stand or collapse under scrutiny. To them, the answer on the board wasn't proof. It was suspicious. Jason leaned forward in his seat, voice dripping with sarcasm. Yeah, okay. He wrote something. But is it even right? Bet he messed up the first line, and none of you noticed. A ripple of agreement spread through a few students, eager to latch on to doubt rather than accept the uncomfortable truth of what they had just witnessed. It wasn't that they couldn't see Marcus's brilliance. It was that accepting it meant rewriting what they thought they knew about him. And Whitaker, still standing at the front, fed that uncertainty. He didn't nod, didn't acknowledge Marcus's work. He simply studied the board with a deliberate slowness, his silence suggesting that something must be wrong. The doubt grew louder. Yeah, he's probably bluffing. Bet he can't explain any of it. If Whitaker asks, he's just showing off. Marcus heard every word. Each whisper pierced his chest like a pin, not because he believed them, but because he knew this was how it always went. When he failed, they mocked him. When he succeeded, they doubted him. It was never enough. His excellence was always suspicious, never celebrated. But Marcus didn't lift his head. He didn't defend himself. His silence wasn't fear anymore. It was strategy. If he spoke, they'd twist his words. If he argued, they'd call him defensive. The only weapon he had was his work, and it stood tall on the board, clear and undeniable. Yet the class couldn't resist. Bet he won't get past the first question if Whitaker gives him another one. Jason sneered, his voice louder this time, as though daring the teacher to make it happen. Whitaker's lips curved into a thin line. Not a smile, not a frown, just the controlled expression of a man who had already made his decision, but hadn't spoken it yet. Marcus's chest rose and fell steadily. Inside, his mind replayed the steps he had written. He knew they were right. He had checked them as he went. But what gnawed at him wasn't the math. It was the knowledge that in this room, truth wasn't enough. Authority mattered more than logic. And Whitaker held all the authority. The whispers escalated. Now it wasn't just doubt. It was accusation. He had to have memorized that. No way he figured it out on the spot. That his brother helped him. Didn't his brother used to be some math whiz? The last one stung. It cut deeper than the rest. Darius wasn't here anymore to defend himself, but they still dragged his name into the room, turning his memory into another tool for dismissal. Marcus's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. He wanted to shout, to tell them his brother had taught him because he cared, because he believed in him, not because he did the work for him. But he stayed silent. He picked the chalk back up. The class fell quieter, curiosity prickling against their doubt. Was he really about to keep going? He had already solved the problem. Why write more? Marcus didn't look at them. He didn't look at Whitaker. He faced the board and began writing again, not to correct himself, but to explain, to show the logic in smaller, sharper steps. His hand moved faster now, each stroke deliberate. He wasn't defending himself with words. He was doubling down with proof. The chalk screeched against the board as he expanded on his work, showing substitutions, clarifying the structure of his solution. Each new line wasn't necessary, but it was devastating. It silenced whispers with clarity. He's breaking it down. Wait, he's actually explaining it. For a few students, awe cracked through their prejudice. They weren't ready to admit it aloud, but they couldn't ignore what they were seeing. Marcus wasn't fumbling. He wasn't bluffing. He was teaching the problem back to them, step by step, his silent determination louder than any boast. But not everyone was swayed. Jason muttered. He's just showing off now. Doesn't mean anything. Others clung to silence, unwilling to shift sides, caught between their doubt and the undeniable work unfolding before them. Whitaker finally stepped closer to the board, his shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. The sound echoed like a gavel. The whispers stilled instantly. All eyes turned to him. Marcus didn't flinch. His chalk kept moving, faster now, as though racing against whatever judgment was about to come. His strokes were clean, controlled, confident. He refused to look up. He refused to give Whitaker the satisfaction of seeing fear. And in that defiance, something shifted again. Because for the first time, Marcus realized the truth. He didn't need their validation. Not Jason's, not the class's, not even Whitaker's. The math validated itself. His work was airtight, flawless, undeniable. The problem wasn't whether he could prove it. The problem was whether they would allow themselves to accept it. That realization steadied him. His hand moved with renewed energy, each line a strike against years of dismissal, each equation a rebuttal to every whisper of doubt. The classroom was silent now, not with ridicule but with suspense. The kind of silence that comes before something irreversible. And Marcus, without lifting his head, without looking anyone in the eye, pressed the chalk harder, filling the last inch of space left on the board. The equation wasn't just solved anymore. It was illuminated, broken down in a way that no one could deny. The chalk snapped in his hand. The sound was sharp, sudden, startling. A piece of white dust clattered to the floor. Marcus froze, his breathing steady but his body tense. The class gasped softly at the break, but it wasn't the chalk they were watching anymore. It was Marcus, the boy who hadn't looked up once, who had written with unstoppable force, who had filled the board not with hesitation but with undeniable confidence. Whitaker's gaze was locked on him, sharp and cold. The whispers had ended. The doubt was still there, lingering, but muted now, smothered by the sheer volume of proof standing on the board. And yet Marcus knew. Whitaker wasn't going to let this end here. The chalk had broken. The problem was solved. But the test wasn't over, because the teacher was about to make his move. The chalk snapped in Marcus's hand, a thin crack that echoed louder than it should have in the silent classroom. A piece fell to the floor, rolling slightly before coming to rest near Whitaker's polished shoes. The teacher didn't move to pick it up. He simply stared at Marcus, his eyes narrowed, his arms still folded tightly across his chest. For a long second, it looked like Marcus might falter. His knuckles were dusted with white, his chest rising and falling quickly. But instead of retreating, he bent down, picked up the larger piece of chalk, and pressed it back against the board. The sound was different now, firmer, more controlled, as though the break had sharpened it. What had started as a spectacle, meant to humiliate him, had turned into something else. The class had been waiting for Marcus to stumble. But the stumble never came. Each line he drew was steady. Each symbol connected cleanly to the last. Slowly, the tide of amusement that had rippled through the room began to die. The smirks faded, the whispers shrank, and Whitaker's expression began to shift. The smug half-smile he had carried since calling Marcus to the board flickered. It was subtle at first, a twitch at the corner of his mouth, the faint tightening of his jaw. But to Marcus it was clear. He had seen this expression before. It was the same look teachers wore when their assumptions were threatened, when their authority was shaken by someone they hadn't expected to rise. Marcus didn't look directly at him. He didn't need to. He felt Whitaker's unease as sharply as if it were written on the board beside his equations. The rows of desks leaned forward. Students who had once whispered mockery now watched in uneasy silence. Some were impressed, others looked uncomfortable, as if Marcus's success was a disruption to the natural order they had quietly accepted. Jason broke the silence with a scoff. Whatever. Doesn't mean he's right. Watch, Whitaker's about to tear it apart. But even Jason's voice lacked its usual conviction. There was hesitation there, a doubt creeping in despite himself. Marcus pressed on. His chalk moved faster, his confidence building line by line. Each new step wasn't just math. It was defiance, a rejection of every whisper, every smirk, every prove yourself he had been forced to endure. The board was nearly full now, crowded with logic and precision. Whitaker shifted. For the first time, he took a step closer to the board, his hands no longer folded but clasped behind his back. His eyes scanned Marcus's work, following the flow of each equation. The class watched him almost more than they watched Marcus, waiting for a signal, some gesture that would confirm what they were desperate to know. But Whitaker gave nothing away. His face was stone, his eyes sharp, his posture rigid. Still the smirk was gone. Marcus felt it. Felt the shift. The mocking confidence in the room had curdled into unease. For the first time, he wasn't just the one on trial. Whitaker was too. Because if Marcus finished this problem flawlessly, then the narrative Whitaker had built about him, about his place in this classroom, would fracture in front of 30 witnesses. And Whitaker knew it. The chalk squeaked harshly as Marcus closed in on the final steps. His movements slowed, not from doubt, but from the weight of the moment. Each line felt heavier, more dangerous, as if the entire room were perched on the edge of the chalk itself. The students leaned in. Lily's pen stopped tapping against her notebook. A boy in the back straightened, abandoning the slouch he'd worn all period. Even Jason, arms crossed stubbornly, couldn't pull his eyes from the board. The suspense was unbearable. Marcus's hand hovered over the final calculation. His breath hitched. For the first time since he began, he allowed himself to feel it. The enormity of what he was doing. This wasn't just math. This was years of doubt, years of subtle cuts, years of quiet dismissal culminating in one line of chalk. But as he prepared to finish, something unexpected happened. Whitaker spoke. His voice was calm, deliberate, and cold. "Careful, Marcus. That's the step where most students slip up." The words sliced through the silence, calculated to wound. They weren't guidance. They weren't encouragement. They were a reminder that no matter how far Marcus had come, Whitaker was waiting for him to fall. Marcus froze for a fraction of a second. His classmates shifted in their seats, murmurs rising. Some smirked again, hopeful that Whitaker's interruption had rattled him. But then Marcus lowered the chalk and wrote, slowly, deliberately, with unshakable precision. The line was flawless. The murmur stopped. The room fell silent again. The only sound the faint scratching as Marcus completed the next step. Whitaker's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked over the line, searching for an error, a crack, something to expose. But there was nothing. Marcus continued. His chalk moved with renewed determination, as if Whitaker's attempt to shake him had only fueled him further. His strokes grew sharper, bolder, carving clarity into the crowded board. The atmosphere in the room shifted yet again. What had begun as mockery had transformed into something heavier, respect, fear, and disbelief colliding in uneasy silence. But Marcus wasn't finished. Not yet. The board was nearly full. Every inch of space was covered in symbols and logic. Marcus reached the final section, the conclusion, the line that would tie everything together. His hand trembled, not with fear but with the weight of knowing what this line meant. The class leaned forward as one, eyes locked on the chalk in his hand. Even Jason's smirk was gone now, replaced by tense silence. Lily's hand clutched her pen so tightly, it threatened to snap. Whitaker took another step forward, his eyes sharp, his expression unreadable. Marcus raised the chalk, and then he stopped. The pause stretched, unbearable. The chalk hovered just above the board, but Marcus didn't move. His back was straight, his breathing steady, but his hand remained frozen. The entire class held its breath, because everyone knew, the last line, was everything. The chalk hovered in Marcus's hand, trembling slightly, as the entire room leaned forward, breath caught in anticipation. He was one line away from finishing, one step from proving what they all doubted. But in that suspended moment, as silence pressed against his ears, a memory rose, unbidden, unrelenting. It wasn't the board he saw. It wasn't Whitaker's narrowed eyes or Jason's smirk, or the students frozen in suspense. It was Darius, his older brother sitting at the kitchen table, a spiral notebook open, his hands moving with the same steady rhythm Marcus now carried. Darius's voice was low, patient. Don't just copy steps, Marcus. Anybody can do that. Understand the problem like you own it. That way, no one can take it from you. Marcus had been 12 then, his head barely reaching over the kitchen counter, his pencil scratching clumsily as he tried to keep up. Darius had been more than a brother. He had been a guide, a protector, someone who carved light into the shadows of a world too eager to dim it. But Darius's light hadn't been enough for the system that measured him unfairly. Marcus remembered the night Darius came home, with the letter. He had worked so hard for that scholarship, pouring himself into applications, exams, essays. His scores were high, higher than most. His teachers had praised him. His mother had prayed for him. But the letter had said something else. After careful review, we regret to inform you. Marcus remembered the way Darius crumpled the paper in his hand. His jaw clenched, his eyes glassy but refusing to break. They gave it to someone else. Said they reevaluated the criteria. Marcus hadn't understood then. He thought maybe Darius had made a mistake. Maybe there had been a mix-up. But later, he overheard their mother on the phone. Her voice tight with quiet fury. They always do this. They always move the goalposts when it's our children. Darius never admitted it. But Marcus saw what it did to him. The boy who once dreamed of engineering projects and university lectures ended up stocking shelves at the local store. His brilliance suffocated by prejudice. But even as life pressed him down, Darius never stopped teaching Marcus. Never stopped feeding him equations. Logic, shortcuts, tricks. Learn this now, he'd say, because one day someone's going to look at you the way they look at me. And when they do, you'll have the answer ready. That prophecy had come true. Right here. Right now. Marcus's chest tightened. His hand trembled, not from fear but from the weight of carrying Darius's voice. His lessons. His unfulfilled dreams. The board wasn't just a math problem anymore. It was a battlefield. And Marcus wasn't just solving it. He was fighting for something bigger. He looked at the chalk, then at the symbols stretching across the board. A calm settled over him, deeper than anything he had felt before. The whispers, the smirks, even Whitaker's looming presence, all of it faded to the background. Marcus wasn't just going to solve this. He was going to prove a point. He pressed the chalk against the board again, but this time his strokes were different. Slower, more deliberate, like a teacher breaking down a lesson. He wasn't racing anymore. He was explaining, expanding, showing every possible path, every logical reason why his answer was correct. The class shifted uncomfortably. They hadn't expected this. They thought he would scribble quickly, finish the line, and retreat. But Marcus was rewriting the rhythm. Each step he wrote wasn't just math. It was defiance. It was education. It was revelation. "Wait," Lily whispered, eyes wide. "He's showing us how it works." Someone else muttered, "Why is he writing so much? He already solved it." But Marcus wasn't doing it for them. He was doing it for himself. For Darius. For every time someone had told them they weren't enough. The chalk squealed as he filled the last remaining space, then reached for the eraser, wiping part of the board clean, not to escape, but to make room for more explanation. He rewrote the final step 3 different ways, showing substitutions, alternate methods, each one circling back to the same conclusion. The class gasped softly, not because they understood every symbol, but because they saw what was happening. Marcus wasn't just proving he was right, he was proving he couldn't be denied. Whitaker's face hardened. His smirk had vanished completely now, replaced by something colder. His eyes followed every line, scanning, searching for weakness. But the more Marcus wrote, the more undeniable it became. Jason muttered again, louder this time. "He's just showing off. Trying too hard. Nobody cares if he can do it 3 ways." But even Jason's voice lacked weight now. It was shaky, strained, as if he knew his words were losing ground. The rest of the class was caught in uneasy silence. Some leaned forward, watching with awe they didn't want to admit. Others looked away, unwilling to face what they were seeing. For years they had laughed at Marcus, doubted him, assumed his place in advanced classes was charity or luck. Now that story was cracking. Marcus's silence roared louder than any boast. He set the chalk down once more, his chest rising and falling steadily. The board was a battlefield now covered with his victory. Clean, precise, undeniable. But then he did something no one expected. He turned. Not to the class. Not to Jason. Not even to Whitaker. He turned to the empty corner of the room, where sunlight spilled across the wall. His eyes softened, just slightly, as though he were looking at someone only he could see. For a brief moment, Marcus wasn't in that classroom. He was back at the kitchen table with Darius, hearing his brother's laughter, feeling his hand guiding his pencil. He was standing in the shadow of a dream stolen by prejudice, carrying it forward where his brother could not. He whispered under his breath, too soft for most to hear. "This is for you." Then he faced the class again, his silence returning, his gaze steady. The air was thick with tension. Whitaker shifted, the unease in his face now unmistakable. The balance of the room had tilted. Marcus had gone from spectacle to something else entirely, a threat to the narrative. The board was full. The problem was solved, multiple ways. The whispers were silenced. But Marcus wasn't finished, not in his heart. Because this moment wasn't just about solving a problem. It was about rewriting years of doubt. Years of bias. Years of being told he didn't belong. And as he stood before them, chalk dust clinging to his fingertips, Marcus decided his next move wouldn't just solve an equation. It would force them to confront the truth. The classroom had become a living organism, its silence alive, its tension almost physical. The chalk dust hung in the air like a faint mist, floating in the sunlight streaming through the half-closed blinds. Every eye was fixed on the board, where Marcus's logic sprawled across the surface like a mural of defiance. He had shown it 3 ways. 3 different methods, all leading to the same conclusion. There was no space left on the board, no crack through which doubt could slither unseen. And yet the moment wasn't over. The storm hadn't passed. Marcus gripped the last stub of chalk, his fingertips coated in white. His hand trembled not from weakness but from the enormity of what he was about to do. He hovered over the final section, the last detail that tied everything together. It was already clear he was right. But this stroke would seal it. This line would end the game. The chalk pressed down, squealing against the board in a long drawn-out sound that grated on the nerves of everyone in the room. But the sound wasn't messy. It was purposeful, deliberate, the finishing note of a symphony no one expected him to conduct. And then it stopped. The equation was complete. Step by step, symbol by symbol, Marcus had unraveled what had been meant to humiliate him. The impossible problem was now a solved truth, standing undeniable before the class. The silence that followed was unlike anything the classroom had ever known. It wasn't the silence of boredom, or the silence of routine. It was the silence of stunned disbelief, of a collective realization that something had just shifted in the air. Lily was the first to move. Her pen, which had been frozen mid-tap for the last several minutes, clattered onto her desk. She blinked at the board, whispering, He actually did it." The boy beside her swallowed hard, eyes flicking between Marcus and Whitaker. "No way. That's right, isn't it?" Jason, arms crossed tightly, shifted in his seat. His smirk was gone now, replaced with something harder to define. Anger? Embarrassment? His jaw tightened, but his voice came out low and stubborn. "He just copied some trick. Doesn't mean he's smart. Anybody can memorize." But the words didn't carry like before. They fell flat in the thick air, crushed under the weight of the board. Even the students who wanted to believe Jason could see it. The work was too clean, too logical, too airtight. Whitaker stepped forward, closer to the board. His eyes scanned every line, tracing Marcus's work. His hands remained clasped behind his back, but his jaw ticked, a vein pulsing faintly near his temple. He was silent too long, and the silence was dangerous. It left space for speculation. "Is it right?" someone whispered. "Why isn't he saying anything?" Another student murmured, louder. Marcus stood still, his hand lowering slowly to his side. He didn't look at Whitaker. He didn't look at Jason. He didn't even look at the board. He stared straight ahead, his chest rising and falling with calm determination. For the first time, he wasn't just answering a teacher's demand. He was answering years of dismissal, prejudice, whispers, and smirks. His silence wasn't weakness. It was strength. And the silence pressed on Whitaker the hardest. The teacher turned slightly, glancing at the class, his expression unreadable. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then returned his gaze to the board. He wanted to find a mistake. Everyone could see it. He wanted to tear apart Marcus's work, to point to a crack, to restore the balance of authority he had wielded for so long. But the cracks weren't there. Every step was flawless. Marcus had left him nothing. That was the unexpected twist. Whitaker hadn't lost control because Marcus shouted or argued. He had lost it because Marcus gave him no weapon. The work was irrefutable. The authority Whitaker held was being dismantled by the very subject he claimed mastery of. Jason leaned forward suddenly, desperate to reclaim ground. "Mr. Whitaker? Isn't he wrong? Come on, look at it. That can't all be right." But Whitaker didn't answer. His eyes lingered on the final line, the one Marcus had hovered over so long before committing. The conclusion was unshakable. The room shifted again. A low murmur rose, not of mockery but of awe. Students began whispering to each other, their tones different now, their words heavier. "Did you see that? He actually solved it. 3 ways. Who even does that? Man." Whitaker's not saying anything because he knows it's right. Marcus heard it all, but he didn't react. He stood in silence, his body still, his face calm. He didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to explain. The board explained everything. But as powerful as the moment was, Marcus knew it wasn't safe. He knew Whitaker wouldn't let this stand. He could feel it in the teacher's silence, in the tension radiating off him. This wasn't the kind of man who accepted being disproven by a student, least of all by him. Marcus reached down and gently placed the stub of chalk back into the tray. The sound of it clicking against the wood was quiet, but in the stillness of the room, it was deafening. The class leaned forward instinctively. And then Marcus turned. He didn't speak. He didn't raise his chin arrogantly. He simply turned to face them, his eyes steady, his expression calm, as though daring them to say out loud what they were all thinking. The sight of him, chalk dust on his fingers, board full of proof behind him, silence around him, was more powerful than words. Several students looked away, uncomfortable with the shift in balance. Others stared at him in something close to awe, caught between admiration and shame for having doubted him. But the loudest silence came from Whitaker. Because in that moment, Marcus had done what was never meant to be done. He had taken control of the room. The impossible problem was solved. The class was stunned. Whitaker's smirk was gone. But Marcus knew this wasn't the end. Because silence in Whitaker's hands was never surrender. It was the preparation for something worse. And as Marcus stood facing the stunned class, the chalk dust still clinging to his skin, the cliffhanger loomed like a shadow. What would Whitaker do next? Marcus stood before the board, his hand empty now, the chalk resting quietly in the tray. Behind him, the board was covered, layer after layer of flawless logic, sprawling across the green surface like a mural of defiance. The room was frozen. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder than the students' breathing. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence wasn't the stillness of routine. It was the stunned hush of disbelief, the kind that follows something no one thought they'd see. One by one, heads tilted, eyes darting across the board. Some students followed the symbols carefully, piecing together what they could understand. Others just stared at the sheer density of it, recognizing the magnitude without needing to know the details. Lily was the first to whisper, almost to herself. He really solved it. The boy next to her exhaled, his voice unsteady. Not just solved it, he did it 3 ways. The whispers spread like ripples in water. They weren't mocking now. They weren't dismissive. They were heavy, tinged with awe and something else, shame. Shame from those who had doubted him. Shame from those who had smirked when he walked to the board. Shame from those who had bet on his failure before he even lifted the chalk. Jason, however, wasn't ready to yield. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched on top of his desk. He forced out a laugh, sharp and hollow. Come on, you guys are acting like he's some genius. He just practiced this. That's all. Anyone could have done it. But his words hung in the air, fragile, brittle. They didn't carry the weight they once did. The class wasn't buying it anymore. Jason's voice sounded desperate, not confident. Marcus didn't turn toward him. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than Jason's deflection. He stood tall, chalk dust still clinging to his fingertips, his face calm but steady. He wasn't begging for their approval. He wasn't gloating either. He was simply undeniable. And that, more than anything, unsettled them. The students had spent years watching Marcus fade into the background, never calling attention to himself, always quiet. They had mistaken his silence for weakness. But now, in front of them, that same silence had become strength. The disbelief in the room thickened. Man, I didn't even think he was that smart. I feel dumb for doubting him. Why'd Whitaker always pick him if he could actually do this? That last question lingered, louder than the rest. It wasn't directed at Marcus. It was directed at Whitaker. For the first time, the class was beginning to connect the dots. Whitaker had framed Marcus's public trials as expectations, as tests meant to challenge him. But now, seeing the impossible solved with elegance, the students realized the cruelty in it. None of them had ever been put under this kind of spotlight. None of them had ever been forced to prove themselves like this. The admiration for Marcus was undeniable, but beneath it another realization was spreading. This hadn't been fair. It never had. Marcus could feel it in the air. He could sense their shifting awareness, and for a moment, it felt like victory, like Darius's lessons. His mother's faith, his own quiet labor had finally broken through the walls around him. But then his eyes drifted back to Whitaker. The teacher hadn't spoken. He hadn't moved. He stood just a few feet from the board, his eyes fixed on the work, his expression carved from stone. He didn't frown. He didn't smile. He didn't smirk. His face was unreadable. And that silence was more terrifying than any outburst could have been. Marcus knew that look. He had seen it before. In teachers, in counselors, in anyone who felt their authority challenged. It wasn't the look of someone impressed. It was the look of someone recalculating. Someone deciding their next move. Carefully. Deliberately. Jason noticed it too. His smirk returned faintly, though it was shaky. He gestured toward the board. "Mr. Whitaker? Are you going to tell us if it's right or not? 'Cause it looks messy to me." The class turned back toward Whitaker. For the first time, they weren't just waiting on Marcus. They were waiting on him. Whitaker's silence stretched. He let the tension build, let the weight of his authority hang in the air. His eyes flicked across the class, gauging them, measuring the shifting loyalties. And then he looked back at Marcus. The room's awe began to shift into unease again. Because authority had the power to bend truth. If Whitaker said Marcus was wrong, many would believe him. If Whitaker claimed Marcus cheated, some would accept it, and Marcus knew it. He stood tall, his hands at his sides, his breathing steady. But inside his heart thudded with the realization, solving the problem wasn't enough. The battle wasn't over. It might only just be beginning. Because this classroom didn't run on math. It ran on power. And Whitaker still held it. The students glanced nervously between Marcus and Whitaker, waiting for the verdict. Some hoped for acknowledgement. Others expected dismissal. No one knew which way it would go. Marcus finally lifted his chin, meeting Whitaker's eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't plead. He simply looked at him, steady and unflinching, daring him to deny what was right in front of him. The silence pressed harder. It was unbearable now, the air thick with anticipation, the board looming like evidence in a trial. And then in the smallest flicker of movement, Whitaker's jaw shifted. His lips curved, not into a smirk, not into a smile, but into something sharp, calculating, unreadable. The class stiffened, sensing the change. Marcus's stomach tightened. He knew that look. Whitaker wasn't about to admit defeat. He was about to strike back. The silence in the classroom had turned suffocating. The board loomed behind Marcus, crowded with equations, substitutions, and conclusions. Proof of brilliance no one could deny. The students sat on the edge of their seats, eyes darting between Marcus and Whitaker, waiting for the verdict. Marcus stood tall, chalk dust still clinging to his fingers. His chest rose and fell steadily, his face calm but unyielding. He wasn't asking for approval. He was demanding acknowledgement without saying a word. But Whitaker's expression was unreadable. His eyes scanned the board one last time, then flicked back to Marcus. For a moment, just a sliver of a moment, it looked as though he might admit it, that he might nod however reluctantly, and concede that Marcus had done the impossible. Then his lips parted, and the words cut sharper than any silence. "No." The class blinked. A ripple of confusion spread. Whitaker folded his arms tightly across his chest. His voice was calm, but cold, precise, rehearsed. "This isn't original work. There's no way Marcus solved this problem on his own. He must have memorized it." The air seemed to collapse in on itself. Marcus's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected praise. Not really. But to hear denial after all of this, to hear his effort reduced to a trick, hit him harder than any smirk ever had. Lily's mouth fell open. "Memorized? But he showed us 3 ways. Who memorizes 3 different methods?" Whitaker didn't flinch. His gaze slid past her, as though she hadn't spoken. "Students sometimes over-prepare. It's not uncommon to find these problems online. With enough repetition, anyone can perform like this." Jason seized the opening like a lifeline. He leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning. "See? Told you. He just practiced it at home. Cheating the system." The class murmured, uncertainty returning like a rising tide. Some nodded, clinging to Whitaker's authority. Others frowned, unsettled, remembering how clearly Marcus had explained each step. Marcus's chest burned. He wanted to speak, to defend himself. But he knew how this game worked. Every word he spoke would be twisted. Every defense dismissed as arrogance. His silence had been his shield before. But now, it felt like a trap. For the first time since picking up the chalk, Marcus's gaze shifted to Whitaker's face. The man's smirk had vanished, replaced by something colder. This wasn't about the math anymore. It never had been. This was about control. Whitaker's voice sharpened. "Marcus, if you really solved this, you should be able to do it again. A fresh problem. something you couldn't possibly have memorized. The students exchanged glances. Some leaned forward, intrigued by the escalation. Others looked uneasy, sensing the unfairness but powerless to challenge it. Marcus clenched his jaw. He could do it again. He knew he could. But the insult cut deeper than the challenge itself. No one else had ever been forced to prove themselves twice in a single class period. No one else had been asked to carry the burden of doubt over and over. Still, he nodded slightly, his eyes never leaving Whitaker's. Whitaker turned toward his desk, picking up a marker this time, and began scrawling another monstrous equation on the board beside Marcus's work. His strokes were deliberate, almost aggressive, as though punishing the board itself. This new problem was even harder, layered with complexities that would have stumped most college students. The class gasped softly. That's insane. No way anyone's solving that in here. Whitaker capped the marker with a snap and stepped back. His arms folded again. His voice was low, but it carried to every corner of the room. Show us, Marcus. If this is truly your work, prove it again. Marcus's throat tightened. He glanced at the problem. His mind immediately began breaking it apart, piece by piece. It wasn't impossible. Not to him. But before he could move, another voice entered the room. The door creaked open. Everyone turned as Principal Harper stepped inside, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. She was a tall woman with sharp features and an even sharper presence. Her eyes swept the room quickly, landing on the crowded board, then on Marcus standing in front of it, chalk in hand.
Mr. Whitaker, she said evenly. What's going on here?
The students straightened, whispers rippling in the back rows. Marcus froze, chalk still between his fingers, caught between relief and dread. Whitaker turned, his tone shifting instantly into professional courtesy. Principal Harper, perfect timing. We're in the middle of an exercise. Marcus here has presented a solution to an advanced problem, but I have concerns about the authenticity of his work. The words hit Marcus like stones. Concerns about the authenticity. Not excellence, not brilliance, not even unexpected. Just doubt, carefully framed. Harper's brows arched slightly. She glanced at Marcus, then back at Whitaker. Concern? Whitaker gestured to the board. As you can see, the solution is extensive. Too extensive, given the difficulty. My fear is that Marcus may have studied this exact problem beforehand. I was just about to have him try a different one to confirm. The class held its breath. Marcus's heart pounded. He wanted to shout that he hadn't memorized anything, that this was his work, his logic, his mind. But he stayed silent, his eyes flicking to Harper, searching for some sign of fairness. Her expression was unreadable. She studied the board, her sharp eyes moving over the layers of work. The room waited, the tension unbearable. Then she turned back to Whitaker. I'll observe, she said simply. The words settled like a gavel. The stakes had risen higher than Marcus had ever imagined. It wasn't just about the class anymore. It was about his reputation, his credibility, his very place in this school. Whitaker nodded, a thin smile playing at his lips. He gestured toward the fresh equation he had written. Well then, Marcus, let's see it. The students shifted, the whispers starting again. Man, this is crazy. He has to do another one? That's not fair. That he can't pull it off twice. Marcus's hand tightened around the chalk. His chest burned with anger and exhaustion. But beneath it all, there was resolve. Darius's voice echoed in his mind again. One day, they'll look at you like they looked at me. Be ready. Be undeniable. He lifted the chalk. The class leaned forward. Harper's gaze locked on him. Whitaker's smirk returned faintly at the corner of his mouth. And Marcus, standing before them all, knew this wasn't just another problem. This was the moment that would decide everything. The air in the classroom felt heavier now, as though the walls themselves leaned inward. Listening, 30 students sat frozen, caught between awe, confusion, and unease. At the front, Marcus stood still, chalk in hand, the completed equation looming behind him like a silent witness. Principal Harper had entered at the very moment Whitaker turned denial into accusation, and now her sharp eyes surveyed the room like a judge on trial day. She took 2 steps closer to the board, her heels clicking in rhythm, her gaze moving across Marcus's work. She didn't speak immediately. She traced the steps silently with her eyes, following the neat sequence of substitutions, simplifications, and final conclusions. The class held its collective breath, as though her silence might unravel everything. Finally, she turned to Whitaker. This work looks thorough, she said evenly. But if you want absolute confirmation, I'll set the next problem myself. The room gasped softly.
This was the twist no one expected.
Whitaker's jaw twitched, but he masked it with a stiff nod. Of course, that would be ideal. Marcus's chest tightened. Another problem, another test. But this time, it wouldn't come from Whitaker, the man who had always framed his trials as impossible. This time, it would come from someone who didn't underestimate the weight of authority. Harper wasn't just a teacher, she was the principal. Her word would decide whether his brilliance was recognized or erased. She picked up the marker Whitaker had dropped on the tray and faced the empty section of the board. For a long moment, she didn't write. She stood there, tapping the marker lightly against her palm, her eyes steady on the surface, thinking. It wasn't a rushed decision. It was careful, intentional. She wanted a problem no one could claim had been memorized, one difficult enough to strip away every excuse. Then she began. Her strokes were sharp, deliberate. Line after line filled the board, a complex system that intertwined advanced calculus with layered algebraic manipulation, the kind of problem even strong college students might falter at. By the time she finished, the problem stretched wider than Whitaker's original test, dense and intimidating, a web of logic waiting to trap anyone who wasn't truly capable. The students shifted in their seats, eyes wide. Are you kidding me? Someone whispered. That's impossible. No way he does this in front of us. Whitaker's lips curved slightly, almost as if satisfied. Perhaps he thought Harper had gone too far, that Marcus would surely stumble now. Perhaps he believed this problem would bury Marcus in failure, confirming his doubts once and for all. But Harper capped the marker and stepped back, her arms folding as she turned to Marcus. Her eyes weren't cold like Whitaker's. They were sharp, probing, but not dismissive. If this is truly your work, she said, her voice steady, then show us. The words landed like a gavel. The students leaned forward. Jason grinned, smugness returning. Yeah, let's see it. Bet he can't do this one. Lily shot him a sharp look. You just want him to fail. Jason shrugged, his grin unbothered. Of course I do. That's what's about to happen. But his voice wavered at the edges. Marcus's throat felt tight, but he didn't flinch. He stepped closer to the board, eyes scanning the problem. His mind clicked into motion immediately, breaking it down, searching for the entry point. The complexity was staggering, but it wasn't impossible. No problem was impossible if you knew how to dismantle it, piece by piece. He remembered Darius's words. Don't let the size of the wall scare you. Find the first brick, remove it, then the next. Before you know it, the whole thing comes down. This was a wall, and he was ready to take it apart. But before he moved, before he even lifted the chalk, he caught Whitaker's eyes. The teacher was watching him, not with neutrality, but with sharp intensity. Whitaker wasn't waiting for success. He was waiting for failure, eager to seize the first misstep, eager to twist it into proof. Marcus inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He couldn't afford hesitation, not with the class watching, not with Harper present, not with Whitaker ready to pounce. Principal Harper stepped aside, giving him space. Her face remained unreadable, but there was no malice in her gaze. She wasn't rooting for him to fail. She wasn't rooting for him to succeed either. She wanted truth. The class, however, wasn't neutral. I'll give him 2 minutes before he messes up, Jason whispered loudly. He did the last one. Lily shot back, frustration in her voice. That was luck, Jason sneered. This is real. Their words pressed against Marcus's ears. But he didn't let them in. He blocked out the whispers, the smirks, even Whitaker's piercing gaze. He focused only on the board, on the dense wall of symbols waiting to be dismantled. He reached for the chalk. The students stilled, breaths caught. Some leaned forward so far their notebooks slipped off their desks. Others sat rigid, eyes wide, not wanting to miss a single stroke. The silence was thicker than ever, charged with anticipation. Marcus gripped the chalk firmly, his hands steady now. He stepped closer to the fresh space Harper had filled, his eyes narrowing as he traced the first step in his mind. And then quietly, without a word, he lifted the chalk to the board. The room held its breath. Whitaker's smirk flickered faintly. Jason leaned forward, eager. Lily clenched her pen so tightly it threatened to snap. And Marcus, silent and steady, prepared to write again, ready to prove not just that he could solve it, but that he was undeniable. The chalk touched the board again. A faint squeal rang out. sharp enough to make a few students wince. But no one looked away. Every eye was locked on Marcus, waiting, doubting, hoping or fearing what would come next. This problem was bigger, denser, far more intimidating than the first. Principal Harper had chosen it carefully, building it like a fortress of logic. Even the best prepared students in the room wouldn't have dared to attempt it without a calculator, a textbook, and hours of quiet study. But Marcus wasn't afraid. He studied the wall of symbols, his mind moving faster than his hand. Piece by piece, he broke it apart. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. His strokes were sharper now, his rhythm quicker, as if each line drew power from the one before it. The class watched in silence, their earlier skepticism wavering. Jason muttered under his breath, though not as loudly as before. Yeah, okay, he got lucky last time. This one's different. He'll trip. But the conviction in his voice was gone. It sounded more like a plea than a prediction. Lily leaned forward, her eyes wide. She whispered to herself, "He knows it. He really knows it." Marcus erased a section of the board and rewrote the step in a simpler form, showing his work clearly. His movements were faster now, almost fluid, as though the chalk was an extension of his hand. He didn't pause to second guess. He didn't freeze at the whispers. He didn't even look at Whitaker, though he could feel the man's gaze burning into his back. For the first time, Marcus wasn't just proving himself. He was teaching. The students leaned in, following his steps with furrowed brows and parted lips. Some of them began scribbling notes in their own notebooks, trying to capture what they were seeing. Others sat stunned, realizing they were witnessing something far greater than a simple classroom exercise. Principal Harper remained still, her eyes sharp, her arms folded. She didn't smirk like Whitaker, didn't frown like Jason. She watched with measured interest, her expression unreadable, but attentive. And Whitaker, his silence grew heavier with each passing second. His smirk was gone, replaced by a stiffness around his jaw. His eyes narrowed as he searched the board, hunting for mistakes, but each line Marcus wrote closed the door further. There was no stumble, no crack to exploit. Marcus's confidence grew with each stroke. His hand moved faster, the chalk gliding smoothly, as he dismantled the fortress Harper had built. He wasn't just solving, he was dismantling. He was showing them all that brilliance wasn't bound to skin color, that his mind could stretch just as far, if not farther than anyone else's in that room. The whispers in the class shifted. He's going to finish it. Look at how fast he's going. He's better than Whitaker. That last comment silenced even Jason. The words hung in the air, undeniable. Whitaker's face paled slightly, his jaw clenching tighter. His arms unfolded, then folded again, as though he couldn't decide how to contain himself. For the first time he looked unsettled, not smug, not dismissive, but shaky. Marcus's strokes came quicker now. He was approaching the conclusion, the steps aligning neatly, the solution unfolding with undeniable clarity. He erased and rewrote, double-checking as he went, not out of fear but out of precision. The class leaned forward, breaths caught. Jason muttered again, softer this time. No way. He's not supposed to. Lily whispered, he's finishing it faster than the first one. And he was. What had taken him nearly an entire period to prove before now came together in half the time. His hand moved with certainty, his posture upright, his silence heavy with confidence. He wasn't defending himself anymore. He was declaring himself. Whitaker stepped forward slightly, his face pale, his eyes darting frantically across the board. The silence wasn't in his control anymore. It belonged to Marcus. Marcus pressed harder with the chalk, his strokes bold, unshaken. The final steps came swiftly, like the last notes of a symphony building to a crescendo. His chest rose with quiet defiance as he reached the last line, and then without hesitation, he wrote the solution. The chalk screeched against the board one final time before snapping in his hand, a sharp crack that startled the class. The stub fell to the floor, rolling across the tile. But it didn't matter. The problem was solved. Perfectly. The class erupted in a wave of whispers, gasps, and stunned exclamations. He actually did it. 2 problems, both impossible, both solved. No one can say it's memorized now. Lily's voice rose above the rest, her tone fierce, almost protective. See? He didn't cheat. He didn't memorize. He's just smarter than all of us. Jason slumped in his chair, his face red, his mouth opening but no words coming out. For the first time he had nothing. Marcus dropped the chalk from his hand, dusting his fingers against his jeans. His chest rose and fell steadily. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The board spoke for him, louder than words ever could. The silence returned, not disbelief this time, but awe, heavy, undeniable awe. Principal Harper stepped forward, her heels clicking against the floor. She studied the board carefully, her eyes tracing every step Marcus had written. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she gave a small nod, subtle but visible. Recognition. The students caught it instantly. Murmurs spread again, this time tinged with admiration rather than doubt. He did it. Harper knows it too. But Whitaker's face drained of color. His authority, once absolute, now hung in the balance. The control he had wielded over Marcus with subtle bias, with smug smiles, with unfair challenges, was shattering right in front of his students. Marcus turned slowly to face him. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. His face remained calm, but his eyes were sharp, steady, unwavering. For the first time, the power in the room didn't belong to Whitaker. It belonged to Marcus. And the teacher looked pale, his authority crumbling, as if he had seen the future and realized it no longer included him standing above Marcus. The bell rang, but no one moved. For a moment, the sharp metallic sound seemed foreign, like it belonged to another world outside the four walls that had just witnessed something extraordinary. The students remained in their seats, staring at Marcus, staring at the board, then at Whitaker, whose pale face betrayed the unraveling of authority he once carried like armor. Marcus didn't wait for permission. He set the broken chalk down, wiped his hands against his jeans, and walked back to his desk. His steps were steady, but inside, his chest was tight with a storm of emotions. Anger, relief, exhaustion, vindication. He slid into his seat without looking at anyone, keeping his eyes low even as the room buzzed back to life. Whispers erupted immediately, louder now, no longer confined to cautious mutters. "Did you see that? He did both. Perfectly. I didn't think he was even capable. But that was unreal." The words rippled, carrying through the classroom like wildfire. For years, Marcus had been invisible, dismissed as quiet, underestimated, because of his skin color and silence. But now, invisibility was gone. His name was in every whisper, his brilliance undeniable. Whitaker tried to regain control. He cleared his throat sharply, his voice strained. "All right, that's enough. Pack up your things." But the command fell flat. The respect that once made his voice law in this room had been shattered. The students obeyed only half-heartedly, still talking, still buzzing about what they had seen. Even those who hadn't spoken to Marcus in years were glancing at him differently now. By the time Marcus left the classroom, the story had already begun to spread. The hallway was alive with noise, lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking on linoleum floors. Yet amid the usual chaos, whispers of his name threaded through. "That's the kid from Whitaker's class. He solved both problems. Like, college-level stuff." "No, not just solved," he explained them, like a teacher. Marcus kept walking, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his head down, but his ears caught everything. Each word was proof that the story was growing, mutating, spreading across the school like wildfire. By the end of the day, everyone would know. He wasn't just the quiet black boy anymore. He was the boy who silenced doubt, the boy who stood against Whitaker and won. Still, Marcus didn't smile. He didn't bask in the attention. Instead, his chest ached with the weight of something heavier, because he knew the truth. This wasn't victory. Not really. It was survival. He hadn't been celebrated because of his brilliance. He had been forced to prove it under pressure no one else would ever face. The equation hadn't been a challenge. It had been a trap. And though he escaped, the scars of that trap were still fresh. The whispers followed him all afternoon. By lunch, students he barely knew were approaching his table. Some with genuine admiration, others with shallow curiosity. "Marcus, can you help me with my homework later? You should totally join the math team. Man, you embarrassed Whitaker bad. That was legendary." He nodded politely, offering little more than a quiet, "Yeah, or maybe." He wasn't rude, but he didn't engage deeply, because he could hear the undertones too. The ones that said, "You're valuable now, because you impressed us, not because you existed, not because you were human." Jason passed him once in the cafeteria, muttering under his breath, "Don't think this changes anything. You just got lucky twice." Marcus ignored him. He had learned long ago that some people clung to prejudice like armor. They would rather deny truth than let it change them. By the end of the day, the buzz had grown louder. Teachers whispered in the lounge. Students exchanged the story in the halls. Some exaggerated the details, claiming Marcus had solved problems in seconds, or that Whitaker had stormed out in humiliation. The story was morphing into legend, but Marcus carried it differently. To him, it wasn't a legend. It was a burden. Because beneath the whispers, beneath the awe, one truth gnawed at him. He should never have had to prove himself like that in the first place. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of orange and purple, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, where Darius had once tutored him. His notebook lay open, untouched. His mother, Cassandra, moved about the kitchen, cooking dinner after another long shift. Naomi, his younger sister, sat nearby, chattering about her day. But Marcus's silence was heavy. Cassandra noticed. She set down the spoon, wiped her hands on a towel, and looked at him. "You did something today, didn't you?" Marcus hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Yeah." Naomi's eyes widened. "Everyone's talking about it. Marcus, they said you solved the hardest problem in the school, and even Principal Harper saw it." Cassandra's gaze softened with pride. "I knew you would. I told you they'd see what I see." But Marcus's eyes lowered. "They only saw it because they wanted me to fail. That's the only reason I was given the chance." The words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. Cassandra sat down across from him, her face serious now. "You're right. They pushed you harder than they'd ever push anyone else. But you turned their trap into proof. That's not nothing, Marcus. That's everything." Marcus didn't answer right away. His fingers tapped the table absently, his mind replaying every moment. The smirks, the whispers, Whitaker's denial, Harper's test. Finally he whispered, almost to himself, "It shouldn't take proving myself over and over for them to believe I belong here." Cassandra reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "One day you won't have to. But until then, keep being undeniable." Her words steadied him, but they didn't erase the ache. Because Marcus knew his mother's promise wasn't a guarantee. The world wasn't fair. Darius had been undeniable too. And still, the world had found a way to dim his light. That night, as he lay in bed, Marcus stared at the ceiling, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The whispers of his classmates, the pale face of Whitaker, Harper's sharp eyes, they all replayed in his mind like fragments of a movie he couldn't pause. He had survived. He had won. But it didn't feel like victory, because one truth still needed to be spoken. And Marcus knew, deep in his chest, that if he didn't say it, no one else would. The night after the storm of whispers, Marcus sat alone at the kitchen table. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a single lamp. His notebook was open, blank, though his pencil rested in the crease, as if waiting for him to start. The sounds of the city drifted faintly through the window. Distant sirens, a car horn, the hum of life continuing outside. But inside the apartment, the silence was heavy, pressing. Marcus didn't reach for the pencil. His hands rested on the table, fingers curled loosely, his gaze distant. The weight of the day replayed in his mind, the board filled with his logic, the stunned silence of his classmates, Whitaker's pale face, Harper's sharp nod. It should have felt like triumph. It should have felt like freedom. But instead, it felt incomplete. Because when the story spread tomorrow, and he knew it would, his name would be on everyone's lips. But Darius's name, the brother who had poured his brilliance into Marcus's hands, would remain forgotten. His brother's light had been dimmed by prejudice, smothered before it could shine, and Marcus knew his victory would never feel whole unless Darius's story lived alongside it. His mother's footsteps sounded softly in the hallway. Cassandra appeared in the doorway, her scrubs replaced by a worn sweater, her face weary but proud. She looked at him for a long moment, reading the heaviness in his shoulders. "You're carrying too much alone," she said quietly, moving to sit beside him. Marcus finally turned, his voice low. "They looked at me today like I wasn't supposed to exist. Like solving it was a trick, and even after I proved it, Whitaker still tried to make me feel small." Cassandra's eyes softened, her hand reaching for his. "And yet, you didn't let him. You stood taller." Marcus shook his head. "I only stood because Darius taught me how. He should have been the one in that room today. He should have been the one they called genius." The silence between them deepened. Cassandra's eyes glistened, her voice unsteady when she finally spoke. "You're right. He should have been. But this world, It didn't give him the chance. That's why you have to carry him with you. Every problem you solve, every step you take forward, you're bringing him with you. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat tight. For the first time all day, his eyes burned, moisture blurring his vision. He blinked quickly, willing the tears not to fall. Naomi appeared then, sleepy-eyed, clutching a small stuffed bear. She padded into the kitchen and climbed onto the chair beside him. "Mom said you were amazing today," she murmured. "Is it true?" Marcus gave a small, tired smile. "I guess." Naomi leaned her head on his arm. "I wish Darius was here. He'd be so proud." The words hit him harder than anything else. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close, his chest tight with the ache of absence. That night, long after his mother and sister went to bed, Marcus stayed at the table. He pulled his notebook toward him and opened to a fresh page. At the top, in neat handwriting, he wrote, "For Darius." Then, below it, he began to sketch equations. Not because they were assigned, not because he needed the practice, but because each line felt like a continuation of his brother's voice, a promise that the lessons Darius had given him would never be erased. The next morning, when he walked through the school hallways, the air was different. Heads turned, whispers followed him again, but they carried a different tone now. "There he is. That's the kid who beat Whitaker. He's a genius." Some looked at him with respect, others with envy, a few still with skepticism, but no one looked at him with invisibility anymore. He had shifted from the quiet black boy to something undeniable, but Marcus didn't smile. He didn't slow his pace. He kept walking, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his notebook pressed against his side like a shield, because he knew labels were fickle. Today they called him genius. Tomorrow they might find another way to dismiss him. What mattered wasn't what they said. What mattered was carrying forward the legacy that had been stolen from his brother. Later that week, during a quiet study period, Principal Harper called him into her office. The room smelled faintly of old books and polished wood. She gestured for him to sit. "You surprised a lot of people, Marcus," she said evenly, folding her hands on the desk. "Your work was extraordinary." Marcus shifted in his chair. "Thank you. But I also want you to know something." Her eyes sharpened. "It shouldn't have taken all that for people to believe in you. What happened in that classroom was not just a test of skill. It was a reflection of bias. And you deserve better." The word stunned him. He hadn't expected acknowledgement. Not from her. He nodded slowly, his throat tight. She leaned forward. "You carry something rare. Not just intelligence, but resilience. Don't let anyone make you smaller than you are. And don't forget who you're carrying with you." Marcus's eyes flickered up at her. She didn't know Darius's name, but somehow she had spoken directly to him. He left her office with a steadier step. By the end of the month, the whispers had turned into something else. Stories, admiration, even quiet apologies. Teachers who once overlooked him now asked for his input in class. Students who once mocked him now came to him for help. But Marcus never let the attention change him. He remained quiet, focused, deliberate, because he knew attention could vanish as quickly as it came. What wouldn't vanish was the truth he carried. One evening, weeks later, he returned to the kitchen table, his notebook open again. Naomi sat across from him, her math homework spread out. "I don't get this part," she said, pointing to a problem. Marcus leaned forward, guiding her gently. "It's like this," he explained, drawing the steps carefully. His voice softened, patient, steady, the way Darius's had once been with him. Naomi's eyes brightened as the answer clicked. "Oh, I get it now." Marcus smiled faintly. "Good. See, you're smarter than you think." And in that moment, he realized something. His brother's legacy wasn't just in his victories. It was in every lesson passed forward, every light he lit in someone else. The day Whitaker tried to break him had become the day he carried Darius back into the world. Marcus closed his notebook that night, writing one final line at the bottom of the page. "They tried to silence us, but we will always answer." The camera of memory pulled back then, leaving Marcus in the soft glow of the lamp, his sister by his side, his brother's voice alive in his work, and the narrator's voice lingered, sharp, unflinching. Marcus's brilliance was undeniable, but how many others are still being overlooked? How many Dariuses, how many Marcuses, sit quietly in classrooms right now, dismissed, doubted, erased by bias before they've had a chance to shine? The question hung heavy, demanding reflection. Stories like Marcus's shouldn't have to happen, but they do, every single day. If you believe no child should be doubted because of the color of their skin, type yes in the comments. And if this story broke your heart, subscribe, because